Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to be a little more away from the podium. I'm short, so if I'm behind the podium, you're not going to see me. So I am Dr. Rob Painter. I come from Northeastern University in Boston. I'm going to talk to you today about small languages surviving in the age of texting. It's good to see you all here today. I know the after coffee break is a little bit rough. So I'll tell you what I tell my students, that I'll try to be interesting if you try to stay awake. That'll be our little deal here. So to give you a roadmap of where we're going in the talk today, I would like to talk about the broad issue of endangered languages in general. You hear a lot about dying languages, severely endangered languages in the popular headlines. And I'd like to sort of go beyond the sort of fanciful notions and really look at endangered languages in the world by the numbers, and particularly get into the issue of competition from large global languages. From there, in the middle of the talk, I'd like to talk about speaker attitudes. There's a lot in the literature that positive attitudes in particular towards an endangered language can actually help keep that language alive. So that'll be the middle section of the talk. And finally, in terms of concluding, I'll of course give you my final thoughts, and hopefully they'll be as interesting as your eager faces are expecting, so we'll go with that. So we're talking broadly today about this huge issue of language death, or used Gene Aitchison's fairly grim wordings, how languages end. You know, language death is not a mystery. It's studied widely by linguists. There's any number of textbooks, monographs, journals on it. There's probably too much academic literature about it. But the nature of the current crisis just really isn't widely discussed outside academia. So let's start with what you do see. Let's start with the media, the popular headlines. Not so infrequently, things pop up, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Yahoo News, the most despicable news known to mankind, that languages are in danger of being lost. So a couple years back, you might have seen this one from Deutsche Welle. This was a report that 13 dialects or language varieties in Germany were in trouble. So the Frisian dialects, you might know, aren't doing particularly well. There's certain dialects of Dutch on the German side, or Danish on the German side of the border that are in trouble. Sorbian, a Slavic language, is endangered too. So that's a headline that crops up. And just this summer, as I was preparing this talk, we had the New York Times talking about the case of Icelandic, and this fear that Icelandic is going to end up in that Latin bin, that there's this younger generation of Icelanders that really favor English for their language of communication to the outside world, and it's a pretty stark headline. And then also, I couldn't escape the topic all summer long. So again, in the New York Times, there was this article on Haida, a language you may not know, but it's the First Peoples language of British Columbia. It's got less than 20 speakers left, and they're trying to revitalize it with things like making a film documentary about raising awareness. The headlines always tend to be fairly alarming. They're almost overly alarming. They've got grim factoids that many of the 6,000, 7,000 languages, they can never be sure how many languages there are moribund, they're dying, they're in decline. And you often see quotes like this: by the end of the century, 50 to 90% of the currently spoken world's languages could be extinct. And that sounds really alarmist, except you realize, wait, it's also really unspecific. If 50 is half, 90 is like almost all. So how bad is the situation? So I want to look a little beyond the popular headlines and explore the nature of the crisis a little in more depth. The first thing you have to do is you have to be clear when you're talking about languages dying, what dying means. And as the quote here says, you're not talking about well-understood pathways of linguistic evolution. We're not talking about Latin becoming Old Spanish, or we're not talking about Old English becoming Middle English and then Modern English. As Aitchison writes, we're talking about the more dramatic and far less normal event, the total disappearance of a language. Language death, it's kind of a generalization. It's always caused by a wide range of things, and almost more importantly, each case of a language dying sort of follows its own trajectory and path. Some factors that crop up again and again in the literature are things like this. First, you just get bad news. Bad news in the headlines. War can destroy a speech community. You think about the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, epidemics. You think about mass genocide in South Sudan. All these nasty things that could just completely wipe out a village or a town can wipe out a speech form with it. Then you've got the decline and acquisition problem, and this is one of the ones I'll be talking more about in a minute, but this is where the parents speak the heritage or minority language, but for whatever reason they're not passing it on to the kids, and they should be. And then increasingly in the modern era, you've got this issue of competition from the big ones, the big global languages, things like English, Spanish, Chinese, you know them. And in this talk, I'd really like to focus on those latter two things, the decline and acquisition problem and the competition problem. By the way, can you all hear me as I can't tell, I'm speaking this microphone. You're still smiling, so I haven't lost you yet at like 5 minutes. So to understand the nature of the problem better, I want to get into sort of the numbers of the ecology of languages of the world. And on the graphic here, I've given you some languages of Eurasia. I'm talking about the small guys, the lesser known guys. You're all polyglots. Maybe some of you speak some of these languages, but they're rarer, smaller ones. Now, one major source that you can rely on is Ethnologue. Ethnologue is a fairly big organization. It's maintained by teams of linguists. It's the one the linguistic academic community looks to quite a bit. And they say that there's some 7,099 languages spoken in the world. Now, in practice, that's a very specific number. They didn't say 97, they didn't say 98, they said exactly 99. There's exactly 7,099 languages in the world. And in practice, of course, it's very difficult to count languages because of that whole language and dialect question that Sebastian talked about this morning in the opening. This isn't the place to get into it at all, but just as a very quick overview about what I'm talking about, think about something like Chinese for a non-specialist. People tend to think, oh, you speak Chinese, you speak Mandarin, cool. Little do they know that there's lots of Chineses. As a matter of fact, there's a huge range of Sino-Tibetan languages spoken across China. These aren't dialects. These aren't little quirky variants on a mainstream Chinese. These are full-fledged languages with millions of speakers. And I gave you some common words there for like I, you, man, fish, meat. And you can see the forms in Mandarin, Hakka, Cantonese, Southern Min. They're all quite different. Often the tone is different. So it's hard to count languages. Counting languages is imprecise, but even so, something like around 7,000 languages in the world tends to be a widely reported and defended number. I mentioned that source Ethnologue a moment ago. They publish editions every year, and you can see from the graphic that for the past 4 years, they've sort of leveled off at about 7,000 languages, which is to say that if you ever hear statistics that like there's 12,000 languages or 30,000 languages in the world, it's probably a little overinflated, or that's what the linguistic community believes. So once you know that there's 7,000 languages, Sebastian alluded to this morning too, that they're not spread homogeneously over the planet. People tend to think of Europe as very linguistically diverse, but with only 4% of the languages of the world, Europe's kind of just fairly monolingual. That sounds terrible, but what are you going to do? I'm already in it. Then you have Asia. Southeast Asia has about a third of the world's languages. Equatorial Africa has about a third of the world's languages. And what I'm calling the Pacific here are things like the archipelagos off Southeast Asia and out into the Pacific Ocean. They have about a quarter of the world's languages. And I was very happy to find this map this summer. This is just a phenomenal visualization. It's basically the rating of linguistic clustering, how concentrated languages are based on geography and color. So the darker purple is what you're really looking at. So you've got this nice area in Central America with linguistic richness. You have the Colombian-Brazilian border is pretty good. But this huge purple blotch, that's Central Africa. That's where a huge number of languages are spoken, about 500 Niger-Congo languages alone. Southeast Asia has richness. And this blotch over here is Papua New Guinea, where there's just a huge linguistic diversity. And now you're ready for some bad news? We can get into the bad news. So the diversity of human languages in the world is being greatly curtailed. It's been particularly badly affected by the rise of global dominant languages. Big languages, sometimes referred to as languages of wider communication, the big ones like English, Spanish, and Arabic, are somehow interrupting the acquisition of more local, more parochial languages. Now, since I'm talking in generalizations, and you're totally letting me do it, no one's saying, you're talking in generalizations. For the purposes of this talk, let's define some terms. Big languages, they've got huge number of native speakers. They've got an impressive number of second language learners. People are coming to these languages and taking them on. They've got a global or institutional presence. People are learning them for educational purposes, for business purposes, accessing Hollywood and Bollywood entertainment in them, or the internet at large in them. And they've usually got some sort of subjective cachet or prestige. They tend to offer an economic advantage. And then in contrast, small languages really have the properties of smaller number of speakers. That's not always true, but it can be true. And limited second languages learners. Fewer people are going to these languages for whatever reason. They've definitely got more local or regional presences, and they're certainly not a medium to the wider communication of the greater world. The stat I've given you there at 94%, basically 94% of world languages have less than 1 million speakers, and that in comparative relief is to suggest that most languages of the world are small in this sense. So then the question is, how many of these small languages are actually really in trouble? So I've mentioned Ethnologue a couple times. They use this beautiful rating of language vitality. And there's quite a few definitions to take in here, but you've got the bigger side of the scale: international languages, national languages, ones with sort of a provincial, sort of regional bias, all the way down to threatening, shifting, moribund, nearly extinct, dormant, and then dead. Not the greatest. At its basis, this Ethnologue rating is one of transmission. It really addresses two questions. Is the language spoken particularly widely, and certainly whether the parents' generation are in any way passing it down to the younger generation of speakers. And the crucial category is that middle 6A, 6B category, where 6A is vigorous, 6B is threatened. And now I have to get really close to the screen to read this. Threatened is the language is used for face-to-face communication with all generations, but it's losing users. There's something about an outside language interrupting the acquisition process. And then category 7 really stresses the transmission problem. The childbearing generation can use the language among themselves, but it's not being passed on to children. And this immediately evokes the sociolinguistic famous example of the 3-generation rule. This is discussed by, among other people, Sarah Thomason. And so you have heard of this sort of thing before. The oldest generation, they're monolingual in the minority language, and just biologically they're getting older, and eventually they'll die. Their children, the parents' generation, has the minority language, but then for whatever economic or social reason, they've also become bilingual in the outside, bigger language. And then the youngest generation is just monolingual in the outside language, and they don't acquire the heritage language at all. So across 3, 4, 5 generations, what you get is this attrition of the number of people who are acquiring that small language. So then, if you want to know about the health of world languages, all I need to do is I can go to that 6B category where you've got threatened and count all the languages that are on the endangered list, and it's clear that the health of small languages is very, very poor. So here are the endangered ones, counting from 6B down to category 9, dormant. That's some 2,467 languages, or a little more than a third of the world's languages are currently in danger of extinction. And then in the same breath, it's worth sort of pointing out how the big languages are doing. Nearly 2 billion people worldwide, about a third of the world's population, speak one of only 6 languages in that international category, which is to say that 1% of all world's languages are spoken by about a third of the population, which is just incredible. And here are the ones. You're no stranger to many of these. Chinese in all its form has something like 1,200,000,000 million speakers across many, many countries. Spanish in South and Central America, English in former British colonies, Australia, the United States, Arabic throughout the Middle East and across Northern Africa, if not elsewhere, and Hindi and Bengali in India. These are the big languages. Once you sort of move beyond Ethnologue, you can get into UNESCO, and UNESCO has a wonderful resource, the Atlas of World Languages in Danger. And much like Ethnologue, the purpose of this resource is to really track global linguistic diversity. They keep their own count, but it's strikingly similar to Ethnologue. They've got 2,464 endangered languages in the world. They've got their own rating system. Where is it? It's up there. It's a 5-point system: vulnerable, definitely, severely, critical, and extinct. So if you look at their share of the pie, both of these major sources by reputable linguistic databases, Ethnologue and UNESCO, are both reporting that somewhere between a third and almost up to a half of world languages are critically endangered. The quote on their website, at least 43% of the estimated 6,000 languages spoken in the world are endangered. So I want to show you a little bit what endangerment looks like. Here is the UNESCO map for Australia. And you should take in all those orange, red, and black dots. Those are language forms, and they're not in particularly good shape. It got cut off, but you can see that there's about 108 languages recognized. It's felt that prior to European contact, there were some 300 Aboriginal languages spoken in Australia. By 2000, that number was down to 90. And as Sarah Thomason writes, if these trends continue unchecked, by 2050, there will no longer be any Indigenous languages spoken in Australia. You get a similar picture of colonization in the United States. This is the Pacific coast of the United States. You can see all the black dots. You can see a huge clustering of red dots, which usually correspond to a First Peoples reservation. The statistics here are from Anderson, same sort of story as Australia. After European contact, there were about 175 First Peoples languages in the United States. None of them are doing well. They're virtually all moribund, and certainly a lot of them have very few speakers. And I want to show you what that looks like. So this is, I love the quote. It says, spoken within the range of the historical northern spotted owl, which is, I don't know why you delineate that, but that's pretty good. So Stephen Anderson tabulated language by speaker number. And you might say to yourself, okay, Halcombe Elm, 225, that's pretty good. But what about Chetco? That's 5 speakers. Kos, 1 speaker. Hoopa, 8 speakers. These aren't vibrant language communities where there's a huge groundswell of people speaking it on a day-to-day basis and passing it on to the next generation. These are very few isolated individuals with, unfortunately, no one left to talk to. And I want to show you the descriptive statistics on last speakers because in a lot of ways they're representative of the majority of endangered languages in the world, many of which have speakers only of that last oldest generation. Septuagenarians, octogenarians, nonagenarians. And the key point is that it's just a biological point, that the key number of the last speakers of a huge number of languages worldwide are set to die off in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. So consequently, within the lifetimes of everyone here, the number of languages on the planet is going to fall from about 7,000 to about 3,000 comparatively rapidly. And now, some fear-mongering. Linguistically, that's what you might call a mass extinction event. If you're worried about Mr. Polar Bear, you might be interested in worrying about one of several thousand languages. And you might counter that, languages have always come and gone on the face of the planet. No one here is texting in Sumerian. No one's writing emails in Etruscan. Even the Homeric dialect for the Iliad and the Odyssey, that's not spoken anymore. It didn't make it. One of the things that's interesting about death in the modern period, however, it seems that rate of attrition, that rate of loss, is greatly accelerating in the modern era. And not to put too sharp a point on it, but many linguists in the literature have pointed out that the situation for endangered languages is far worse than for Mr. Panda Bear or the tiger or the polar bear. The threat to spoken languages is worse than the threat to endangered species who are losing their habitats, global warming, and things like this. So when I teach, I often stress that threat to world languages is one of the most pressing concerns that the field of linguistics should be engaged in. There's definitely a need to get out there and document and describe languages before they just vanish without a trace. As David Crystal eloquently writes, when a language dies which has never been recorded in some way, it is as if it has never been. And that's a sobering thought for me, at least. Many linguists now do this. They race out and practice what's called salvage linguistics, where you identify the last 1, 2, or 3 speakers that have any competency in the language at all, and you try to document it for posterity before it wipes out. So one of my favorite linguists is a guy named Nicholas Evans, who had done a lot of work on Australian Aboriginal languages. You can see he took a picture of these Kaidalit men in 1982 on Mornington Island, and you can see from the caption, very unhelpfully, they're all dead, deceased, deceased, deceased. And that's the sad story, is these last speakers die. Something permanent is really lost for the entire community of individuals who was ethnically a member of that speech community. The next generation often regrets it. The children of the last speaker, they might have some sort of limited cultural knowledge of the language, but there's just no way to access the competence linguistically. As Aitchinson writes, the final generation of speakers of the language generally just knows things like plants, animals, and place names in the language, things that are culturally important to them. And occasionally linguists get the question, though, isn't this a good thing? Isn't it wonderful that everyone in the world can go to a few globalizing languages? It's just like Star Trek with the universal translator. Isn't that great? Such people are clearly not polyglots, but that's a story for another time. So the answer tends to be something like this. There's a linguist that you might know for his work on Paraha, Daniel Everett. He points out that the sum total of what linguists know about language is infinitesimally small compared to what isn't known. And I just love that graphic, which I shamelessly stole from his book. Basically, there are lots of undocumented things about languages that once they're lost forever. And they're really quite awesome, just to speak casually about it. As if any evidence were needed in this particular audience to prove it, languages are cool. And I was going to give you more in a longer version of this talk, but I wanted to give you at least one representative sample from the linguistic literature about things that are just coming to the fore. And so the one I chose to present on was Chinantec de San Pedro. This is a language spoken just south of Oaxaca. It's only got about 3,000 speakers left. And they're one of those few languages of the world that are said to have whistle speech. If you've never heard of whistle speech before, this tends to develop on topographies that are very rugged, where it's very hard to move around. Let's say there's a big canyon that it's too far to shout across. You can whistle across. And you're like, well, what is that, like Morse code? How advanced could it be? Well, it turns out these whistle speeches tend to be really quite advanced. So hopefully the tech guys here are going to help me out, and this will play just perfectly. Mirando a él un poco. Oh, okay, polyglots. Challenge extended. Yeah, we just raised the bar here. So as languages die, it's clear that something of the richness of human language is lost forever. And my favorite quote about this is a guy, Wade Davis at the University of British Columbia, and he says, the loss of one language is akin to the clear cutting of old-growth forest in the mind. And I love that idea of like language as a tree, that the root system has come out and spread over 100 years, and it's come up towering, and it's adapted to its environment, and then boom, it's just gone. And that richness of what that was is over. So I've been fairly grim for about 20 minutes, and now let's turn to the more positive side of the talk. What can be done? Before I get into the role of language attitudes, I should stress that there is government and official level language policy and planning, and this can stave off language death. As Geir Wigan wrote in 1997, speaking of Icelandic in Iceland, both the official status of Icelandic, the alertness of the whole country and cultural issues, the active legal support and protection of the language, its general use in all parts of society, all speak in favor of its non-endangered position. So yes, we can do things on institutional levels, and linguists can intervene. Sometimes they don't intervene so well, but that's again a story for another time. What I'd really like to stress is the fight to maintain smaller languages often happens on a much more grassroots or organic level. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to address the role that speakers' attitudes play in maintaining languages in the face of big globalizing languages. As a bit of background, a little sociolinguistic background, language death always begins with some sort of conflict or tension. Two languages come into contact, and there's immediately mismatches in prestige. You might know that small language communities, by and large, tend to already be bi or multilingual. It's perfectly normal in many parts of the world for someone to get up and go through their daily existence speaking 1, 2, 3, 4 different languages. The trick is that when a community is small and it's isolated, say it's in the rural hinterlands, it's easier for speakers, particularly young speakers, to feel this sort of economic pull or social cachet of a bigger cultural center and a bigger language. And you might have seen something like this from basic linguistics, that two languages that are in competition are often competing for function, that speakers in multilingual communities often divide up function, what we call domains of usage, very specifically. So you might use X and Y are in one bilingual community. You might use language X for religious purposes. You might use it for work emails. You might talk with your boss in language X. There might be certain cashiers at the shops you use language X in. And then you use language Y for personal emails and conversing with friends and things like this. So that's basic stable bilingualism. And case studies of language death really point to situations where small languages very rapidly give up functionality to big languages. So you can see in the graphic, language Y formerly was used for a range of functions, and it has come to be used just in the home. And that's a very clear-cut endangered language situation where a language gets relegated just to be used with parents and things like this. there were any number of case studies to choose from the research, and one I wanted to call your attention to was by Bent Preisler in 1999. It was actually a case study of American English stealing functionality from, of all things, Danish and Denmark. And it was a curious case study for a few reasons. One was that the kids were leading the influx of English into Denmark. The Danish kids were interested in certain social things, like they were listening to rock music where the lyrics were in English, or they were going to hip-hop clubs where, again, the lyrics were in English, or they were taking place on these mass online games where the interface language was English. And the reason I'm highlighting this case study is that it shows that things like the function of use can pertain not to just active use. You know, we tend to think about being bilingual as a choice. I'm going to speak this language to this person. I'm going to speak that language to that person. But often it's more subtle. Often it's more passive, and you don't know that you're changing your linguistic habits. So you can see from the table there that one of the things that Preisler surveyed was passive experience. You have to bear in mind this was in 1999. And he found that Danes, at least once a week, 93% heard and listened to English, and 88% saw and read English. So there's this passive acceptance of a global language creeping into the daily life. And of course, you see this all the time. This is German Cosmo, in case you're wondering. But the case studies show that a shift in language use really begins with a shift in the relative importance of the two languages in the speech community. And I said it before, and I'll say it again, younger people are leading the change. So this is Danish Cosmo. It's German Cosmo. It's very much a German language periodical, but notice how much English there is and how much untranslated English. You've got fun, fearless, and female. You've got sorry, an ubiquitous German word. You've got s'express yourself, whatever s'expressing yourself is. But the German editors of this magazine knew that there was this cachet, there was this marketing appeal, this otherworldliness. You want to be truly cosmopolitan German girls? Read in English. You know, there's that pull, there's that outside acceptance that that's going to be a motivating factor to pick me up and buy this magazine. And there's a lot of research in the linguistic field that shows that speakers' attitudes towards their native languages, and I'm talking about their impressionistic, subjective feelings about the forms of speech they speak, really plays an important role in their survival. As Sarah Thomason writes, if a language is on the brink of endangerment or extinction, its speakers' opinions about it may speed, hinder, or even reverse its decline. And again, you'll know this a little bit intuitively. You know, this rings true, at least it rings true to me, that how speakers feel about their smaller language vis-a-vis an outside language really impacts how much you use it, right? So do speakers feel it's like perfectly normal to converse in that, you know, lesser known dialect? Or is it somehow wrong or sinful to use it? Are they proud of who they are? Do they focus on their identity? Do they like who they are? Or are they somehow ashamed? Do they want to hide that part of their personality and their identity by not speaking the language? Do speakers feel that their language has a future or not? Or is it just, you know, that's what mommy and daddy speak back home, but out in the global world we speak something else? And importantly, do speakers feel they have a future or not, economically and socially, speaking their particular language? And so all the literature points to the fact that negative attitudes towards a language by its speakers really hasten its decline. And to point you in the direction of a couple case studies, one of the best places to think about this sort of thing is North American languages. Very often, as children, the speakers of these languages went to white-run, state-sponsored boarding schools, and they had the crap kicked out of them. They were hit by rulers, they were caned, they had their mouths washed out with soap, and whenever they didn't speak English, these children were just, you know, really abused. And so they felt that it was wrong, it was sinful to speak their language, and some of the quotes speak for themselves. Tlingit is a language spoken up on that range of mountains there in British Columbia and the Yukon, and the elder speaker writes, whenever I speak Tlingit, I can still taste the soap, where they washed their mouth out. Or this Pomo I think is spoken in California. When I was 11 years old, and every night I cried, and I'd think to myself, I'll never teach my children the language or all the Indian things I know. I mean, these languages were stamped out of them. Sometimes it's more of an economic pull. There was another case study in the literature where there was a Zapotec dialect in southern Mexico spoken south of Oaxaca, where all the women of the village decided, you know, our kids aren't going to have a future in Zapotec. They had been raising their kids in Zapotec and bilingual in Spanish, but then it was announced that the state authorities were opening a cement factory down the road. And they knew that there was going to be money sluicing through the community, there were opportunities sluicing through the community. So overnight, the women just said, hey, no, we're not teaching our kids Zapotec anymore, we're just teaching them Spanish, Spanish only. And the bilingual community became monolingual overnight. That's quite impressive. On the other hand, for some good news, there's positive attitudes towards a language by a speech community can certainly help preserve it. This is an older case study, but I think it's a good one. Wolfgang Wölck examined the attitudes of high school German students towards the Low German minority language vis-a-vis the intruder High German, which had been making inroads for centuries into this particular area. And he really wanted to know how Low German was being preserved in this particular time, in this particular place. So he used a survey tool. This is the kind of thing you'd ask in a sociolinguistic questionnaire. Kannst du Platt verstehen? Do you understand Low German? Hörst du gern Platt? Do you like listening to Low German? Wenn ja, lieber als Hochdeutsch. If so, better than High German. Möchtest du gern besser Platt können? Would you like to know or speak more Low German? And he tallied up the responses of some, say, 200 high school students. And at that particular time, at that particular place, in that particular community, Wölck found that the school children were really not just speaking the heritage language with Oma and Opa back at home, but they were speaking it everywhere, and which is to say that there were active functional domains of use for Low German. And there was no stigma. There was no negative vibe that it was sort of just this funky minority language in this particular place. As a matter of fact, it was a kind of bilingualism built on snobbery, that these Low German speakers felt, well, yes, that's who we are. We're the bourgeois, we're upper class, we're educated, we've got good bones, good teeth, nice Germanic hair, we're set. And they tolerated High German in their community. And as Wölck concluded, this is certainly very atypical for any minority language and a very good omen for the vitality and survival potential of Low German, as is the high percentage of students who favor the language. But incredibly few languages tend to develop that kind of beautiful, stable bilingualism where the right positive attitudes towards all the language in the mix are there. The one case study in the literature that comes up again and again is the Valpais region of Brazil, which is highly bilingual. I gave you the map here. You can see there's a whole bunch of linguistic forms completely overlapping each other in a very otherwise sort of desolate hinterland kind of space. And what's interesting is that the bilingualism is so pervasive, people just live with it. One person can have a conversation in Tijuca, someone else can have a conversation with them in Tucano, and both are like, oh yeah, they're speaking a different language, but I'm going to speak monolingual my language, he's going to speak monolingual his language, because all languages are pretty much equally cool, and they live with it. So to summarize, negative value judgments toward a small language among its speakers really will accelerate its decline. Positive value judgments towards a small language will lead to its continued vitality. And earlier in the talk, I talked about Danish and German. And those are big languages. Those are national languages, millions of numbers of speakers. We're not talking about the traditional small languages. But the thing is, the attitude effect is the same, is that a language like English can make great inroads into those communities if these less than positive attitudes get fixated upon by the younger speakers. I mentioned the Preisler case study of Danish. Foster just had a paper on standard Belgian Dutch and Flemish showing the same exact thing. And what these case studies point to is, unfortunately, there just simply isn't that overt awareness among speakers that they're even holding biased views towards their own language. And it's that lack of awareness that's the central problem. That's what leads to those subtle linguistic shifts in function of who's speaking what to whom, where that more globalizing language creeps in and it steals functions, steals domains from the more parochial languages. So to kind of conclude here, can smaller languages survive in this embattled climate? And the first point I'd really like to leave you with is that cultures and communities which celebrate linguistic diversity are always going to be more linguistically diverse in practice. It's fairly clear that usage of these smaller languages is key, and there's so much that can be done. I mean, it's never been easier for a small language to have a huge megaphone that you could tweet, text, blog, Instagram, Facebook, and probably 50 other social media platforms that I don't even know exist yet. But that can be a window of opportunity, that young people can really reach out and make a presence for these languages on the internet that wasn't formerly possible. It will certainly keep them in the forefront of public attention. And the goal of what you're going for is what Crystal has called healthy or stable bilingualism. This is a state in which languages are seen as complementary, not as in competition, fulfilling different roles, with each language being seen in a rewarding light. And you might say, Rob, that's the most fanciful ivory tower academic garbage I've ever heard. And I will grant you that that is a little bit academic and ivory tower thinking, but there does need to be a rise in public awareness of the value of linguistic diversity. And I think, advocating for being a polyglot, celebrating being a polyglot is certainly a positive step in the right direction. It's a great outlook to say, yeah, I speak languages. Why? Because they're interesting, they're cool, they're all worthwhile. I meet great people, I get different sides of life, I get interaction that I wouldn't have had. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, so maybe I'll move on to the next slide. And certainly you can advocate for the value of languages is certainly a worthy goal, especially in an era where we're sort of creeping to this strange global, not monolingualism, but few lingualism, if you will, where half the world's population is increasingly speaking one of just very few international languages. And the practical example of the kind of thing I'm talking about might be something like this website. I have a secondary interest in translation, and Transferia is a website dedicated to translation between small dialect to small dialect. Sometimes Welsh poetry is translated into English, sometimes Galician poetry is translated into English, but what can Welsh tell us about Galician? What can Galician tell us about Welsh? Why do you need the outside middleman? So this is an advocacy for the use of literature of smaller languages and using the internet in a positive way to celebrate that kind of diversity. The second point I'd like to leave you with is that positive attitudes towards small languages are certainly key. As we've seen, languages are always going to do better when their speakers recognize them very early on as an important part of their identity and part of their culture. And one of the things that's nice about positive attitudes is that if speakers are proud of who they are and proud of what they do linguistically, it shores up the transmission problem. It solves the transmission problem. They want to teach those languages to their children and pass on that heritage. And then certainly positive attitudes specifically by younger speakers has a real preserving effect on a small language in the face of that globalizing pressure. And this seems to be especially true in the research in the age of the so-called digital native. I don't really like that term myself, digital native. It sounds like you've got spears and a keyboard at the same time. But these are young people who never have known the world without the internet, without cell phones, without the iPhone. And so they're just as happy to text and Instagram. And with, again, that megaphone, they can really give a presence to small languages that wouldn't otherwise be there in the modern era. But of course, building these positive attitudes towards communities, starting with that single issue of raising awareness that there's a problem to be dealt with, that's the greatest challenge to saving small languages. And as you can see here, this is my map of 26 what I call invisible endangered languages of France. You tend to think, oh, languages of France, doing okay, but there they are on UNESCO, endangered. You have to be aware that there's even a problem to be dealt with. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention. I've seen a lot of eyeballs, which means you're paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have some time for questions. I'm sure you've all got a lot of questions you want to ask. So
thank you for your talk, Rob. I was happy to hear that you're passing on to your students the idea of the importance of documenting endangered languages. You seem to me to have an emotional and personal relationship with this topic, if you don't mind my saying so. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could tell us when you first became connected to this yourself and how that came about.
I think the answer is two things. The first, I had to do field work and graduate study on Babanki, which is a small language of Cameroon. And the guy, our speaker, was wonderful. He really loved this. It was a Niger-Congo language, but he didn't like his own language. What he liked was French. He was so proud. He'd gone to secondary school, and he'd learned French, and it was a mark of social standing. And I'm like, but you've got this really fascinating tonal language. It's got all sorts of cool morphology. Don't you want to talk about that? It's like, no, let me tell you about my high school days in French. It's like, but the language, Babanki, it's awesome. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is I spent a little bit of time researching and working on Faroese in the Faroe Islands. And Faroese is another sort of small language in the sense where English is making great inroads there. And much like Icelandic, they've tried to put up barriers and try to invent words and keep things alive. But that really sort of sparked me on the literature. And I've read some of the early stuff by Nancy Dorian, who I'd highly recommend. She's one of the great researchers in this field. And it just sort of, stuck. Once you sort of become impassioned about this stuff, it's there.
You are a true hero.
Thank you.
I'll start with that.
Okay.
Another thing is that one thing you actually haven't touched on, by the way, 2 of your 26 invisible French languages are on my tag.
Awesome.
Another thing to also keep in mind is we've lived in a time as well, despite the great extinction that you speak of that we hope will not come, we've actually seen significant inroads in which endangered languages have been used in entertainment, get millions of views on YouTube, get featured on, for example, Disney movies, South Park, even one song featuring endangered language, having won the Eurovision Song Contest last year.
Yeah.
And to what degree can we somewhat encourage more entertainment in a lot of these endangered languages? And above all, is it a good omen or just a consolation prize?
Well, there's a lot of pieces to that. The first thing I want to say is that there's a lot of superficial work that's done. Actually, a lot of the literature in the linguistic field is what linguists have done, and actually, I'm sort of a mixed view that sometimes institutions do a great deal of work preserving languages, but a lot of it has to just come from the community. There has to be a grassroots up sort of situation where people realize that the language is important, the language is dying, we need to preserve it. It needs to be grandparents, parents, and kids. Linguists can facilitate, but we're not clinicians. We don't go out and necessarily do what we should do. So I take your point that it's often very superficial, that there's this sort of busyness. I was thinking as you were asking your question about with the Disney movie Frozen, where they have that monolingual, they have the song and they show the multilingual clip of how Disney recorded that in 33 languages. And it's really quite interesting, but I'm saying, well, does that save anything? I'm not sure I've answered your question in any way, shape, or form, but my feeling is I'm one for real efforts where if a community would get onto Facebook and do all their Facebooking in a small language, that would be valuable. I'm one for if people are writing poetry, novels, and sort of promoting their languages in meaningful ways, I'm for that. Am I for the 25 most interesting words in the language that's dying? Not so much. So I do think there's a divide between what's a useful endeavor online and what's a sort of spurious or superficial endeavor online. Okay.
Hello. Is there any program to make a global database of all, an audio database of all endangered languages, to record them and how they are spoken by those people before the languages go extinct?
There's quite a few, and actually I think Sebastian wants to jump in here with a question, but UNESCO maintains a wonderful database of endangered languages. If you go to their website, they can give you the top notes of many things I talked about today. They're I think, a strong resource. Ethnologue, I think, is a good resource, but they tend to be a little more opaque. You have to sort of get into their view. But there's numerous databases. Linguistlist.org maintains samples of very small languages online, and you can access their types of material. Sebastian, do you want me to pass it to you? To someone give that guy a microphone.
Thanks a lot. By the way, this was a wonderful talk, but there are many things where we couldn't continue the discussion. As to global efforts to document those languages, this is what language documentation is about, this new field of linguistics, which was established around 2000. And there have been a number of initiatives, and they have so far documented to some degree some 300 to 400 languages. Sometimes it's only a sample of half an hour, sometimes it's a huge collection of 100 hours. I think the most important collection at this time is at SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and that's an ongoing project, so there are still teams going out and doing recordings and transcribing them and translating them and trying to preserve the digital data. DOBIS, Documentation of Endangered Languages, a German program, did this over 15 years, and I think they were the first to establish that. And they have some 80 to 90 languages in their archives, and there are other archives around. I showed a picture in my talk where you had Dobis and Elar and Lasito and Ayla and so forth. So there are some 8, 9 major archives in the world which have such records, but that's of course only a drop on the hot stone because there are so many other languages which will go silent without any recording at all so far.
I would also add to that very often these are run by professional linguists, and often it's sort of raw data. It's less tagged, less in the sense that it's less sortable, it's less searchable in the way that you might want it for a language learning type of endeavor. They vary widely, but very often there's opportunity, much like there's opportunities for translation, there's opportunities for working for these programs as volunteers and going through the tagged data. And they certainly can use language specialists like yourselves that if you can get affiliated with the program.
Yeah. I was interested in the case studies you mentioned about Denmark and in Belgium. I'm from the Netherlands, and I also hear a lot of like comments there about like English becoming stronger. But when I look around there, yes, you hear some words in English creeping in the Dutch language, but it's Dutch that's spoken. It's not English. And the example you gave with the articles also, it has some English words, but when you read the article, it is German. So, and you seem to imply somehow that this is the first step to extinction, and I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit on, you know, if this is actually the first step, or because also in history, languages have borrowed words from other languages.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. In Northern Europe, part of the problem, of course, is that the structure of so many Germanic languages and the vocabulary of so many Germanic languages is essentially, you know, sort of either West Germanic or North Germanic, but it's of a commonality that English word forms can plug in very quickly. Like, you know, think about new words that the German Duden dictionary just added, like liken and selfie and emoji. These are all beautiful German words now. Downloaden, email check-in, you know. So much English plugs in, right? I don't mean to suggest that those languages are anyway drastically in trouble. I'm thinking a lot in terms of this nature of being embattled, that languages, even with a national presence or regional presence, I mean, the ones you mentioned, like Dutch, you know, millions of speakers, and a huge diaspora population, they're spoken globally. The problem is that the same factors that can wipe out a small language can in a lot of ways erode the sense of identity of a bigger language. That's the clarification of the way I would explain that.
So I know this is like a really big issue in China, and I'm assuming it's like an issue in other parts of the world too. But I know that, like, for example, in like a lot of like rural parts of China that are very impoverished, when we have like places where there's like a native, very small language spoken, and the people are being educated and moving to like big cities, they're how can we account like what can be done when we have this kind of diaspora of speakers of small languages into these big cities and integrated into this more like national global community, and they're moving away from like their native societies?
Well, I don't mean to be chicken-hearted, but I think China is like the like one of those third rail kind of situations, because not only do you have what might be called very close language dialects related to one another, so diglossic situations, but then you also got like mixed language forms. You have whole things like sociolinguistic register. Are you speaking low versus high dialect of the particular form? And so, I mean, it's tricky. Like with a little goodwill, something like certain high Beijing dialects of Chinese are intelligible with more provincial dialects, but without that goodwill, they're completely non-mutually intelligible. So the answer to your question is really, you have to say for which speakers, under which circumstances, in which sociolinguistic kind of varieties you're going to talk about. So I don't mean to sort of like sidestep the question, but like you're absolutely right that there's the question of like whose Chinese is it. But I mean, the purpose of the slide I was showing you was, you know, there are a lot of Sinitic forms, and to lump them together as Chinese is ridiculous. They often refer to Chinese as a macro language, like almost a super linguistic variety that, you know, holds a lot of families together, very closely language forms together. Again, I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but sidestepped it a little.
Thank you very much.